So today I'm going to talk about human and divine action in Herodotus Histories, I'm just going to begin with a few general reflections that may be of use to those of you who are not too familiar with the work. Herodotus Histories are a major source for understanding the Greco-Persian Wars of the early 5th century BCE. And they're a foundational text in many ways, not least to those of us interested in history writing, but also those working in fields like ethnography, looking at ancient travel writing, geographic discourse, etc. And it's clear from the outset of this work what the author's agenda is for this work. He tells us it's the display of the inquiry of Herodotus of Halicarnassus, so that things done by man may not be forgotten in time, and so that great and marvellous deeds, some displayed by the Greeks, others by Barbaroi, do not lose their glory, including what was the cause of their waging war on each other. So it's worth kind of holding on to that outline for this work as we progress in this talk. There's been considerable debate and kind of continued lively debate in the scholarship in Herodotean studies concerning Herodotus's religious disposition, his relationship with the divine, and in the last but one slide on this presentation, I've given quite a few references that speak to that big theme in the scholarship. Undoubtedly, there are lots of narratives, of which I will address quite a few of those in this talk, that incorporate different kinds of religious phenomena or supernatural elements. And here we could kind of draw a crude but perhaps meaningful contrast with Thucydides, that other historian of the 5th century, but also, though to a lesser extent, Xenophon writing in the 4th century and others too. Looking for doctrine has been a difficult enterprise, and that's not what this paper has done, and others have done great work to say more about that. But there's a certain kind of reticence that does come through in certain parts of Herodotus's work, and here I just cite an example of that, where Herodotus says he's not eager to talk about matters pertaining to divinities, but he'll mention them when he feels compelled. Nonetheless, there are passages that kind of point to some kind of Herodotean theology. And again, I emphasize this is not the purpose of this paper. Others, not least Tom Harrison, and his book on Herodotus has done a great deal in this area. And so I give just a sampling of passages that could be used if one wanted to explore further what is kind of Herodotus's attitude towards the divine. So here's a passage, for example, where he talks about oracles. Many of us will know it well. If indeed this passage is genuine, he's saying that I wouldn't want to discredit oracles when they speak so plainly. Near the end of the work, and this is a passage I will come back to later, he talks about the many proofs of the divine interacting somehow in human affairs. And he relates that very specifically to two battles towards the end of the conflict between the Greeks and the Persians. Earlier in the work, this is a passage actually at the Helpline that we've looked at quite a lot. So others have inspected this passage a great deal more than I'm able to do here. But Herodotus talks about the forethought of God, a kind of divine equilibrium, according to this passage. And finally, I can't resist this passage from Book 8, where Herodotus talks about Hermotimus, who achieves a great vengeance, the greatest vengeance known, in fact, according to Herodotus. So I think all of those kind of passages can be used to start talking about the divine element in Herodotus's work, and I'll sort of be saying more about some of those in a bit. And that does draw a contrast then, not least with Homer, Herodotus's greatest literary predecessor, and much has been written about the relationship between these two authors. There, of course, Homer has individuated gods who are routinely involved in the stories of Iliad and Odyssey. So there's an obvious contrast between the two. But there is nonetheless kind of divine action in a much more muted way that therefore can be difficult to disentangle and to interpret in the case of the histories. But divine cases do abound. And so with that, this talk will comprise 3 parts. In the first part, I'm going to look at several key instances of divine action in the stories of particular individuals in the histories. Although particular and named gods do not influence events in the histories in a way akin to the Homeric poems, aside from Apollo, that is, and to a lesser extent Poseidon and Demeter, the examples explored here will show the manifold regulatory force that, for Herodotus, the gods exerted in the observable world. In the second section, I'll turn to examine the evidence for divine action in the various battles of the Greco-Persian Wars. Herodotus does not present divine activity on the battlefield itself, yet he leaves readers firm in the view that close analysis of the evidence available to him attests to the intervention of the gods on behalf of the Greek alliance. The final section will then turn to Herodotus's multifaceted account of Xerxes' initial decision to campaign against the Greeks at the beginning of Book 7. This is a passage rich in reasons for action, though ultimately inscrutable in relation to the place of divinity in that action. In exploring these different facets of human divine action in the histories, I'll argue that Herodotus's work serves as a rich storehouse for the different ways in which gods were perceived to intervene in human affairs. While I largely sidestep the issue of how far Herodotus personally believed in those divine activities that he relates, I show that his account treats seriously the idea of supernatural agency in events of the recent or not so recent past. Sometimes it's not possible to discern his stance on the ultimate human or non-human cause of the matter. But at other moments, Herodotus will commit to a particular line of explanation, which centers on a human or a divine cause, or an admixture of human and divine elements. Moreover, I'll demonstrate that the modern notion of double causation has only limited utility for understanding Herodotus's historical approach. Even when divine and human factors are prevalent in the histories, he typically avoids a kind of bland juxtaposition of human and divine agencies. His views on causation prove to be more enigmatic, less schematic than such an idea allows. So, while many of Herodotus's references to the divine concern the religious customs of wider communities, such as kinship groups or particular polis, or even whole nations, he also extends a range of examples that concern individuals who interact with and are influenced by the divine. I'll leave aside the case of Xerxes here, since I examine his interactions with the divine before launching his expedition into Greece later on in this talk. There are several other individuals, however, whose actions intersect with those of the gods, or who in some way invite divine attention. A striking example with which to begin is the Cyrenian king Arcesilaus III, as well as the queen mother Pheretime, who ultimately experiences a terrible, divinely ordered reversal of fortune in recompense for her extreme actions. Pheretime goes into exile with Arcesilaus, following his failed attempt to take back royal power in Cyrene. Later, Arcesilaus manages to reinstall himself as king of Cyrene with the help of the Samians, but flouting the injunctions laid down by a Delphic oracle, he exacts justice against those individuals responsible for his flight. Some of those punished individuals flee altogether, while others are sent to be executed in Cyprus. Arcesilaus soon comes to a bad end, however, when visiting his cousin wife's father, Alazir of Barca. There, several Barcians and exiled Cyreneans kill him in the middle of the agora. concerning Arcesilaus's end, Herodotus writes, whether willing or unwilling, he missed the meaning of the oracle and fulfilled his fate. And I give also a passage that I'll return to in a bit of the similar kind of thinking that manifests elsewhere in the histories along these lines of being able to, fulfilling some kind of fate. So while Herodotus does not elaborate on the origins of Arcesilaus's Moira, whether the result of a specific divinity or some other cosmic energy, the admixture of human and numinous elements here is striking. It is Arcesilaus's own refusal to comply with the command for peace set out in an oracle that sets in train a series of events that will culminate in his assassination. According to Herodotus's account, therefore, Arcesilaus had the ability to alter events, yet in acting as he did, he satisfied Providence. The supernatural quality of events is even more pronounced in the sequel to the Logos on Arcesilaus's death, in which Pheretime exacts brutal revenge on those who wronged her son. Determined to mete out justice, Pheretime marches on the city of Barcaire with Persian forces, regarding the entire city responsible for her son's assassination. After a lengthy and bloody campaign, the Persians prove victorious, delivering up her son's murderers to Pheretime. Not content with impaling those men deemed most responsible, the queen also severs the breasts of their wives and displays them on the city walls for public inspection, and even enslaves the remainder of the Barcians, except a few from the royal house of Battus. So, just like her son, Pheretime demands retribution, but also like him, she will not end well. Herodotus's gloss on Pheretime's demise forms a shocking postscript to this Logos and deserves quoting in full. But Pheretime did not finish her life well either, for as quickly as she departed Libya, having exacted revenge against the Barcians and returned to Egypt, she died horribly, for while living she boiled over with maggots. Thus excessively strong human revenge is denounced by the gods. Such and so great was the revenge of Pheretime, daughter of Battus, taken out against the Barcians. An aside here, I discovered in preparation for this talk that there is in fact a form of worm called Pheretime. It's rather grisly. Herodotus intervenes as narrator here then to make it explicitly clear that Pheretime, who was clearly wronged by those Barcians responsible for her son's murder, sought revenge in a manner that precluded the kind of happier end of life adumbrated by Solon in his famous speech before Croesus at 132. It was precisely Pheretime's human actions seeking such a brutal form of justice which invited divine epithonos, leading to her being eaten alive by maggots. The implications of this cosmic envy for Pheretime's story are clear. By exacting a surfeit of justice, the queen provoked the gods to intervene in human affairs in a way that, from the gods' vantage point, rebalanced the scales of justice. And so there I return to the passage I cited earlier on from 3:108. Herodotus does not deny Pheretime agency in her individual actions, yet he also cannot exclude the role of the gods, who are prone to correct human beings when they overextend themselves. It is not simply a matter of prioritizing responsibility then, of ordering actions parochial and cosmic, for the whole account of Pheretime and her son Arcesilaus is squarely focused on delimiting the nature of their actions. But according to the narrative promulgated by Herodotus, both individuals acted in ways that invited some kind of providential retributive agency or fulfillment. A similar intermingling of human and divine aspects can be gleaned from Book 1's celebrated Logos on the downfall of the Lydian king Croesus. The cumulative weight of Croesus's decisions and actions in this narrative is significant, providing ample proof that Herodotus does not regard him purely as the passive victim of a thesis referenced at 113, which stems from the ancestral fault committed some 5 generations earlier. So that is, of course, Gyges' killing of Candoles and his usurping the Lydian throne. There are, of course, Croesus's rash dealings with advisor figures, including the Athenian Theates Solon, whom he brusquely dismisses as ignorant at 133, sending him away from Sardis, but also the Lydian Sandanis, who fails to persuade Croesus that a war conducted against the Persians can bring no good to Lydia. Then there are those charges that he levelled against the Greeks, some justified, others trivial, according to Herodotus, as well as Croesus's brutal treatment of his half-brother Pantaleon, that is death by carding, and we've had a previous talk that explored that too. And that's referred by Herodotus analytically, of course, at 192. Ultimately, we learn carried out in order to diffuse any challenge to Croesus's power. Moreover, while Herodotus shows that Croesus is genuinely concerned by the military aggression of his eventual conqueror, Cyrus, a marker then of his inability to influence the course of events, perhaps, Herodotus refers at several points, nevertheless, to Croesus's own imperial ambitions, a recurrent motif that here, as with other autocrats in the histories, signals his coming great fall. Perhaps the most significant of Croesus's missteps is his flawed set of interactions with various oracle centres, notably Delphi. As I, and indeed others, have shown elsewhere, Croesus conducts an inappropriate experiment in order to test the authenticity of various oracle centres, but then fails repeatedly to understand several riddling Delphic oracles, which he interprets in a positive and uncritical manner. So his decision to attack the Persians is indubitably his own, but the background role of Delphi is to be noted. Indeed, the gods, and specifically Apollo, emerge as an important agent near the denouement of the Croesus Logos. First, when a rain shower suddenly extinguishes the flames of Croesus's funeral pyre following his entreaties to Apollo. The divine origins of that storm are confirmed in indirect discourse at 191.3. And secondly, in an extraordinary chapter, that is 191, wherein the Pythia relates at length Apollo's defence against Croesus's charge of Apolline ingratitude. Emphasis is placed here on the limits even of divine action. None may escape their allotted fate. I haven't put that on the slide, I'm sorry, I wish I had. So an important passage, and I quote, "None may escape their allotted fate, their Moira, not even a god. Apollo himself could not alter Croesus's fates." But divine action is also highlighted. Apollo not only saved Croesus on the funeral pyre, but he also intervened in order to extend Croesus's rule by a further 3 years. The god even underlines Croesus's fault in failing to comprehend the oracles that he'd sent him. And so, having heard these things, Croesus agreed that the mistake was his and not that of the gods. How ultimately are readers to disentangle this complex network of causes that variously contribute to Croesus's insalubrious demise? Do Gyges' original sin and the curse on the Heraclid line, together with the allotted fates of Croesus that not even a god can alter, combine to form a kind of get-out clause, freeing Croesus from all culpability? Herodotus's rich narrative does not appear to invite such a reading, with its emphasis, underscored by the Delphic priestess, on Croesus acting unwisely in response to oracles, as well as his continued desire for imperial expansion. Coupled with this, however, is Herodotus's inclusion of several divine aspects that limit Croesus's ability to withstand his ultimate downfall. The elaborate narrative that culminates in his fall is not by any means replicated across the rest of the histories, and readers are ill afforded the opportunity to perceive neat patterns of human and divine behaviour that are constant across space and time. But just as with the cases of Arcesilaus and Pheretime, Croesus's all too human deposition is explicable for Herodotus only by recourse to ideas sacred and secular. It is hardly possible to survey the full suite of divine manifestations in particular individuals' trajectories across this work, so it will suffice here to examine a few more notable instances. In Herodotus's monumental Egyptian Logos, Herodotus details the unusual manner in which the pharaoh Sabicus abdicated his throne. Sabicus is recorded to have received a dream in which he was cancelled by a man to slay all the priests of Egypt. Having seen this dream, he said that it appeared to him that the gods put forward a pretext so that he might commit an impious act concerning sacred things, in order that he will experience some evil from either the gods or from men. He would not do these things, he said, for his time had gone. This is as long as he had been proclaimed that he should rule over Egypt before departing. Recognizing that the divine punishes excessively violent human acts, and there's a contrast with Pheretime, Sabicus recalls the oracles previously given to him in Ethiopia, which foretold how he was bound to rule Egypt for 50 years. In doing so, the king refuses to act impiously and controls the events that follow by willingly leaving Egypt. Despite the temptation of absolute power, Sabicus recognizes the fragility of the human experience and acts according to his belief that misleading, divinely sent missives have been sent to encourage him to undertake a heinous deed. Herodotus does not affirm that the dream was indeed superhuman in nature, nor does he sanction Sabicus's view that the gods were leading him to pursue a foolish act. Nevertheless, he records this positive account of King Sabicus's peaceful transition from autocrat to private citizen, which occurs exclusively because of his careful negotiation of what he considers to be a manifestation of numinous import. He therefore stands in stark contrast to several other autocratic figures in the histories, not least Croesus, who, as we have just seen, quite fails to navigate the complexities of human-divine communication. Another compelling case is that of the Spartan king Cleomenes and Leotychides, who together sought to depose the other Spartan king, Demaratus, following a disagreement over interstate politics. Spurred on by Cleomenes, Leotychides claims that Demaratus is not a true son of Ariston and is therefore an illegitimate ruler of Sparta. The Spartans then petition the Delphic oracle on the matter, but Cleomenes persuades the Delphian Cobon to order the Pythian priestess Perialla to proclaim Demaratus no son of Ariston. Having been given this false oracle, which casts Demaratus as illegitimate, the Spartans exile the king. Neither Cleomenes nor Leotychides will avoid punishment for these actions, however, and explicit in the case of Cleomenes is the hand of the divine. First, Leotychides. In phrasing that recalls his assessment of Pheretime's untimely end, Herodotus writes that Leotychides did not grow old at Sparta, but he paid in full a requital for Demaratus in the following way. A few years after the Greco-Persian Wars, Leotychides accepted a large amount of money as a bribe from the Thessalians. Soon after being indicted for this outrage, not only was he forced to flee to nearby Tegea, where he also died, but his entire house was razed to the ground, and we learn that at 672. Herodotus does not ascribe any divine agency then in relating the punishment that Leotychides endured for his treatment of Demaratus, but in his use of the word thesis, Herodotus implies a similar ethical framework here as we saw in the story of Pheretime. In both logoi, order is re-established, whether by a divine agent or some other ineffable energy of the cosmos. Indeed, the destruction of Leotychides' house serves to underscore the complete nature of his reversal of fortune. Finally, Herodotus turns to the rather more complex downfall suffered by Cleomenes. Having banished Cleomenes, after discovering his ruse against Demaratus, the Spartans recall the exiled king out of fear. Cleomenes' behavior becomes increasingly disturbing, however, and the king is therefore put in the stocks. Herodotus then describes in graphic detail Cleomenes' brutal death by self-mutilation. Having related Cleomenes' ignominious death, Herodotus makes clear the four explanations for the fallen king's behavior that were current at the time. The most popular of these, purveyed by hoi polloi Hellenon, many Greeks, was the view that Cleomenes suffered on account of his bribery of the Pythia concerning Demaratus. The Athenians and the Argives put forward alternative accounts, also with a religious dimension, and the Spartans alone claimed that he was not driven to madness by a supernatural influence, but rather on account of his taste for an unmixed wine. So, having reported these variant versions, Herodotus commits to the explanation preferred by most Greeks. But it seems to me that Cleomenes suffered. Lost the page, sorry. It seems to me that Cleomenes paid in full for this requital for Demaratus. The historian here asserts his view, emoi dedoke, that there really was something divine in Cleomenes' demise. Just like Leotucides, he paid a thesis for his maltreatment of Demaratus. In the case of Cleomenes' ruin, then, human agency plays a more muted role. Cleomenes may well have been the one who carried out the dreadful set of actions against himself, but Herodotus affirms the popular view that he was driven to do so by some kind of supernatural force. While not an exhaustive survey of every instantiation of divine intervention in the lives of particular individuals across the histories, the examples explored here show the chronologically and geographically spread ways in which divinity is reported to operate in the events of history by Herodotus or his sources of information. It is, in the histories, it is not usually the case that the divine manifests in human form, or even that the actions of the gods may be subjected to opsis, one of Herodotus's preferred tools for historical inquiry. Yet he provides plenty of evidence for the intangible ways that divine agency, often referred to in abstract terms such as topheion, can be observed and explained. And strikingly, some of these divine actions result from human-like emotions. Witness the divine resentment induced by Pheretime's extreme punishment of the Barcians, or even the sympathy and the favour that Croesus elicited from Apollo, sympathy that was then converted to a further 3 years of rule. Herodotus' narrative of the series of battles from 490 to 479 offers further compelling proof of the complex way that he conceives the role of divine agents in the human sphere. In his account of the battle at Marathon itself, Herodotus generally avoids reference to any external cosmic or supernatural forces, though his account is framed by two anecdotes with a superhuman dimension. Prior to the battle, the Athenian herald Pheidippides claims that he saw an apparition of the god Pan on Mount Parthenion above Tegea, where the god ostensibly told him to report to the Athenians his consternation over the lack of reverence towards him, despite Pan being well disposed to the Athenians. While Herodotus does not present the god as an active presence in the battle itself, Pan is not entirely deprived of agency in the narrative, for the historian relates that the Athenians believed Pheidippides' story, thus setting up a temple of Pan on the Acropolis. What is more, and I quote Herodotus, on account of this message, they appeased him annually with sacrifices and a torch race. For the Athenians, then, the god's intervention immediately before the victory at Marathon forces a permanent change in their worship of the god, precisely because they trust in the report that Pan was, and would continue to be, an ally of the Athenians. Later in the Marathon narrative, following his report of the numbers of men who fell on both sides, Herodotus proceeds to narrate the following thorma. The Athenian Apizalus reported that a great man, an Andromegan, appeared before him fully armoured as a hoplite. This apparition passes him by, however, and proceeds to kill his comrade. At some point in the conflict, Apizalus also permanently loses his sight, despite enduring no injury. As elsewhere, this anecdote is carefully framed by the historian. While he does not name his informant, Herodotus particularly notes that he learned that this story had been recounted by Apizalus himself. Neither passage suggests any direct involvement of the divine in the outcome of the conflict itself, then, Yet combined, they depict something of the way in which certain Athenians perceived the direct influence of divine energy leading up to and during the conflict. Herodotus does not interject to confirm the truth of these accounts, yet their inclusion in his polyphonic record of the hostilities between Greeks and non-Greeks is one that serves to deepen his readers' knowledge about the different kinds of human and divine forces that were current in popular memories about the Greco-Persian Wars. Moreover, the apparitions of Pan and the giant hoplite figure also serve an important literary function within the narrative. While the former divinity openly supports the Greek side, it is clear that the latter works in support of the Persians. By emphasizing the god's seemingly even-handed approach to this human conflict, Herodotus accentuates the uncertainty that most Greeks would surely have felt about the likelihood of defeating the Persian side with its far greater sized army. Proof of divine involvement in the Greeks' war against Persia is only intensified by assembling the evidence for divine activity in the remainder of Herodotus's major battle narratives. Data provided for divine involvement before and during the battle at Artemisium are somewhat minimal, but what the narrator does include by way of divine activity proves to be of signal importance in the outcome of the wars. Herodotus begins with the Delphians, who establish a temple for Theuer and make sacrifices to the goddess in the hope of receiving winds. Next, Herodotus refers to a story concerning the Athenians calling up the wind god Boreas to assist them, also following the suggestion of an oracle. Offering sacrifices to Boreas and calling upon the gods to destroy the Persian ships, the Athenians claimed that it was indeed the god Boreas responsible for reducing the size of the Persian fleet at 7189. Herodotus carefully distances himself from the precise cause of this wind that fell upon the Persians in chapter 189, but he perorates that after the conflict, the Athenians set up a temple to Boreas, an action which recalls the founding of a temple for Pan on the Acropolis following Marathon. After the Persians endure significant losses for 3 days, the Greeks rush back to Artemisium and make libations in honor of Poseidon Soter. So prior to the battle, Herodotus details several attempts made to call upon and propitiate specific deities. The Delphians pray to Theuer, the Athenians make sacrifices to Boreas, and the remaining Greeks pay obeisance to Poseidon the Saviour. Herodotus does not point to any particular god as responsible for the significant depletion of Persian troops prior to Artemisium, but there can be little doubting his conviction that divinity was in some way responsible. Indeed, his viewpoint emerges unambiguously a few chapters later, where he describes the destruction of several Persian ships sailing around Euboea at the time of the Battle of Thermopylae. And so here we have on the slide, and all this was done by the gods so that the Persian side should be made equal to that of the Greeks and not much more plentiful. In this instance, Herodotus's remarks recall his assessment of Cleomenes' downfall. Just as Herodotus believes that divinity intervened in such a way as to induce Cleomenes to kill himself, so too he believes that the gods oversaw the destruction of several Persians at the time of Artemisium and Thermopylae, to create a more even contest between the Greek and Persian forces. This, of course, allows for human action and responsibility to dominate his succeeding narrative of Artemisium and other battles, but it nevertheless foregrounds divine agency as a significant causal factor at this critical historical juncture. Herodotus may not be an historian concerned with relating a religious war, but as with his striking remarks on the Trojan War, and that is at 2120, the destruction of Troy was sent as a warning from the gods that great injustices will meet with no less great divine retribution. He's emboldened to show not only how different people perceive divine involvement in the historical past, but also to demonstrate how gods intercede in human affairs, where his evidence allows for such implicit conclusions. In the case of Thermopylae, references to divine are at a premium, since the narrative is dominated by the Spartans, not least Leonidas's desire for martial glory. Nevertheless, Herodotus also reports that a Delphic oracle was given to the Spartans, which appeared to suggest that either Leonidas as king must die, or Lacedaemon will be destroyed by the barbarians. After quoting the content of the oracle itself, Herodotus surmises that considering these matters, Leonidas therefore sent away allies in the hope of winning glory for the Spartans alone. So even in a battle narrative that appears to be focused exclusively on remarkable military deeds committed by human agents, there remains something of a divine penumbra. Herodotus' supposition that Leonidas's actions were motivated by the content of the Delphic oracle introduces a supernatural face to the battle's origins, even if the gods do not appear in the action of the battle itself. At Salamis, a battle which proves decisive in the favour of the Greek side, Herodotus relates yet further instances of divine occurrences. The exiled Athenian Dicaius, together with the deposed Spartan king Demaratus, witness a great dust cloud on the Thriasian plain, which emits the cry Iacchus in a kind of mock Eleusinian procession. Dicaius understands this as a form of impromptu divination, an ominous sign that portends some great disaster that's to befall Xerxes' army. But Demaratus insists that he remains silent if he wishes to avoid certain death at the hands of the king. Concerning the army, the gods will see to these things, he adds. With this dust cloud adapting into a mist that moves on to Salamis, Dicaius and Demaratus learn that Xerxes' army is to be destroyed. Herodotus maintains a detached voice in repeating this account. At no point does he endorse Dicaius or Demaratus' assessments, nor does he confirm the truth of Dicaius' account, though I note the way that Dicaius is reported to adduce Demaratus and others as witnesses to corroborate his story at the end of 865. He nevertheless presents yet another instance in which the divine is reputed to have some involvement in the conflict between Persia and Greece. The divine agency in this case is one which shows through ambiguous signs the Persian defeat at Salamis. Further divine manifestations before and during the battle at Salamis are listed by Herodotus. Amongst the variant explanations for commencing the battle, Herodotus refers to the report, legatai decai tader, of a phasma of a woman issuing orders to fight so that all the Greek army could hear it. Adding to this is the variant account given by the Athenians, which suggests that the Corinthians fled from the battle, whereby a mysterious vessel appeared, a matter of divine origin, theon topregma, from which men told the Corinthian commander Adamantos and his fleet of the victory being won by the Greeks. According to this Athenian report, the divine agent compels the Corinthians to rejoin the battle, although when they do so, it is already finished. In both cases, then, Herodotus' narrative raises the possibility of divine involvement, albeit at a distance. He doesn't commit to the truth of these versions, though interestingly, while he includes the Athenian account of the Corinthians fleeing the battle at Salamis, he adds that the rest of Greece bears witness to the Corinthians' defense that they were the first to put fight at Salamis. Herodotus' Greco-Persian Wars, of course, closed with a decisive land victory for the Greeks at Plataea, as well as a naval victory off Mycale, which apparently fell on the same day as the Battle of Plataea. In both battles, the historian once more foregrounds divine intervention. Indeed, these two cases of divine activity are striking in their very boldness, despite a certain level of Herodotean reticence in reporting matters concerning divine activity. In the first, Herodotus reflects on the extraordinary fact that no Persian was found to have entered Demeter's sacred grove in Thebes following the battle at Plataea. He regards this as a marvel and proceeds to explain his marvel by recourse to divine interference. I suppose, if it is necessary to surmise on matters concerning the gods, that the goddess herself did not receive them, since they had burnt her temple, the shrine at Eleusis. Although hesitant to ascribe the goddess's motivation, Herodotus cannot find a more compelling reason than the one which seems to be evident. that Demeter intervened in such a way that the Persians could not enter her sacred land. In his cautious attempt at identifying the reason why no Persian bodies were discovered within the precinct, Herodotus can only explicate a divine cause. He affords no human explanation as an alternative. Paradoxically, then, it is the lack of human action, i.e. that no Persian entered Demeter's land, which leads him to infer divine action. Finally, we turn to Herodotus's abridged account of the Battle of Mycale. On the very day of the Greek victory at Plataea, a rumour spreads amongst the troops that the Greeks had proved victorious against Mardonius and his soldiers. Reflecting on this coincidence, Herodotus writes, "It is clear that there are many proofs of the divine element in human affairs. If it is indeed the case that on the very same day the disaster fell at Plataea and the battle at Mycale was about to happen, a rumour reached those Greeks at that place, so that the army was greatly emboldened and eagerly willing to face the danger." As Michael Flower and John Marincola note, Herodotus here intervenes in his own narratorial voice in order to vouch for the view that divine action can be gleaned from empirical evidence, from technaria. And as the discussion of others already shown, not least with the last example with Demeter, this is far from an isolated instance of Herodotus' conviction that the divine intervenes in human affairs, but it surfaces as perhaps his most explicit affirmation of divinity influencing historical events, despite even that careful wording around trusting in the rumour. Enigmatically, Herodotus says nothing about the other proofs that bespeak divine influence on human events, in human events, but he leaves readers here firm in his view that the gods helped to orchestrate this pair of victories on the Greek side. The overall effect of Herodotus' narrative of the Greco-Persian conflict, then, is one in which divinity intervenes in human affairs in certain measurable ways. And it's not straightforwardly the case that events are doubly determined, that they may be regarded equally and simultaneously as being motivated by divine and human causes. Herodotus' judgment is more nuanced, more circumscribed than that, though his manner is often cautious and sometimes his conclusions are provisional. Perhaps one of the clearest illustrations of this approach is his famous pronouncement on the crucial role played by the Athenians during the Greco-Persian Wars, that is 7139. There he expresses the controversial view that it was Athens which held the balance of power. In choosing to defend Greece and to preserve the Greeks' freedom, the Athenians after the gods, and I quote Herodotus, the Athenians after the gods at least were the ones who pushed back the king. Herodotus does not pursue this idea any further, but it would be foolish to dismiss his reference to the divine here as a pietistic expression with no force, for it is clearly not Herodotus' method to assign responsibility for certain outcomes to specific divinities, though there are a few such references in the text. But he leaves readers under no doubt that he considers the gods a genuinely major, if invisible, influence in the battles that he recounts. In the final step of this talk, I light on one of the most significant and much discussed passages in the histories, Xerxes' initial decision to launch an army and invade Greece. Herodotus' Logos on Xerxes, a highly shaded figure in the histories, as Emily Baragwanath and others have shown, and this decision of Xerxes to invade Greece is one rich in insights concerning the reasons that underlay the Greco-Persian conflict, and yet one that, on account of its complex structure and rather enigmatic colouring, resists easy interpretation. To begin, a brief précis of Herodotus' account. Having inherited the Persian throne, following a series of disputes with his siblings, Xerxes calls together a council in which he seeks to ascertain the opinions of many leading Persians about his intention to attack Athens, thereby pursuing the retributive agenda of his father Darius. During this council scene, Xerxes retails his planned military operation before listening to the opposing positions of Mardonius and his uncle Artabanus, standing for and against the campaign respectively. Xerxes castigates his uncle for failing to support his plans, but before sleep he comes to recognize the wisdom in Artabanus's advice. It is at this point, according to Herodotus' Persian sources, we're told, hos legatai hupo Persion, that Xerxes is first visited by a dream figure who's handsome and tall, an Andromegan to Kai Euadia, who excoriates him for looking to change his plans, adding that Xerxes will not be forgiven for his volte-face. Unperturbed by this dream, however, Xerxes assembles the same group of Persian councillors, to whom he apologizes for his earlier rash outburst against his uncle, and explains this change of mind, that is, to remain at peace. But despite his stated desire for peace, a decision that's welcomed by that audience in attendance at 7:13, Xerxes is once again visited by the same dream figure, who warns him that if he avoids this expedition and does not set out with his army immediately, his power will be brought low just as quickly as he had gained a great and powerful dominion. Disturbed by this dream, Xerxes persuades his rather hesitant uncle to impersonate him by donning the royal garb and sleeping in the royal bed. The dream figure appears once more, censuring Artabanus for advising Xerxes against invasion, pointing out too that he is trying to overturn that which must happen, to kreion genesthai. At last, Artabanus, who had earlier sounded a note of deep skepticism about the supernatural genesis of Xerxes' dreams, and so, that is, he thinks Xerxes' dreams reflected only those concerns that had preoccupied him during the day, he considers the dream of divine import. He considers it daimoniae, a message sent by the god to portend destruction of the Greeks. And the divine origin of this message is repeatedly underlined in this passage that I've given you here by Artabanus. Having then set about once more to undertake this expedition against Greece, Xerxes has a third vision, an opsis, in his sleep, wherein he sees himself crowned with an olive branch whose tendrils cover the earth, immediately followed by that crown disappearing. The Magoi interpret this final vision as a sign of Xerxes' acquisition of authority over the whole earth. And so with this positive assessment, Xerxes begins to assemble his vast army. This sequence of events that leads to Xerxes' decision to undertake this fateful campaign against the Greeks, the best illustration of Herodotus' religious outlook, according to Geoffrey de Stanquois, presents a hugely complexified account of the Persians' attack on the Greek world in 480 BCE. Prior to and during the conference with several Persian ambassadors, the divine plays a distinctly muted role, and human factors dominate the decision-making process. Some of the reasons given include, in addition to the theme of vengeance on Athens, an inherited custom of imperial expansion, Mardonius' desire to become satrap of Greece, and a desire for European land, though other, more minor factors play a role too, not least the possibility raised by Xerxes that Athens might attack Persia. Of the divine, Herodotus writes only that the Kresmologos Onomakritos incited Xerxes to attack the Greeks with oracles, and that Xerxes propounded a general notion of divine support for the Persians at 7-8a. So prior to the account of his dreams, readers are not permitted to envisage the Persian invasion as in any sense necessitated by a superhuman agency. The sudden appearance of a dream figure, which is clearly of divine origin in the world of the narrative, whether or not Herodotus personally believed in the dream's numinosity, the narrator's studious reference to certain Persian sources at 7:12 is not sufficient evidence to prove his disbelief, furnishes the Logos with an altogether different mood, whereby Xerxes' actions are much more circumscribed. The dream figure clearly manipulates both the king, when he states that Xerxes' power will be diminished by his refusal to march upon the Greeks, as well as the advisor Artabanus, who, far from having comported himself in a hubristic manner, had clearly warned Xerxes not to undertake this expedition for a wide range of reasons outlined in detail at 710. And while it still remained Xerxes' choice to pursue the war on Greece, it is important to recall that Artabanus was told by the dream vision that he was attempting to stop that which must happen, to Creon Genestai. Encountering such a forceful and persistent presence, the extent to which Xerxes perceives a genuine choice at this moment is enigmatic, to say the least. The role of divinity in precipitating the Persians' march, however, is manifest. Chris Carey does well to observe that a unique expedition like this requires divine prompting on a scale unprecedented even in epic. This whole sequence, as programmatic as it is in Herodotus' narrative, is of course just the start to Xerxes and the Persians' onward march to Greece. Herodotus will proceed to relate many instances of Xerxes' brutality en route to Greece and during the conflict itself. His narrative is also one laden with signs that the Persians will suffer a defeat, signs that go unnoticed by the king and many of his men, though not all. That famous passage at 916 between the anonymous Persian and Lysander. These subsequent events are nevertheless shaped by the events that precede. It is an odd reader indeed to reject the role of divinity in Herodotus's explanation of that moment when Xerxes initiated the final stage of the Greco-Persian conflict in 480-79. So to conclude, Herodotus' work offers a hugely rich portrait of sometimes conflicting accounts concerning human and divine deeds performed before, leading up to, during, and beyond the Greco-Persian Wars. Emerging from this talk, however, is just how complex and multi-dimensional his approach to divine agency is. The divine communicates with human beings through a variety of means, including oracles, dreams, and other portents. And not only does Herodotus provide valuable testament to these communications, he dismisses the objections of those who reject the truth of oracles at 877, and he repeatedly underlines the tendency of powerful individuals to fail at grasping the complexities of divine communication with human beings. And here we looked particularly at the case of Croesus. For Herodotus, communicating to humans through signs constitutes one distinct and significant way in which the divine operates as an agentic force amongst human beings. But the discussion has also shown that divine agency functions in other ways. Gods do not merely interact with human beings through signs. Several examples explored above in this talk attest to the tendency for divinity to act as a regulatory force within the cosmos. Herodotus does not claim to have inspired insight into the thoughts of individual gods, yet he does show confidence to infer certain kinds of divine activity in the human sphere, even if they're not straightforwardly visible in the way that human actions can be. Herodotus' work is also noteworthy for its capacious and generous inclusion of accounts disseminated by various individuals and groups that credit divine agency in human affairs, some of these accounts originating from or even endorsed by the narrator himself. He does not systematically validate others' accounts, of course, and he repeatedly incorporates rival versions of events without committing to the one that he considers the truest, though note his outspoken remarks concerning Pheretime's grisly end and Cleomenes' suicide. With considerable caution and often through influence, however, he does perceive the divine as a distinct and measurable force in the human affairs that he's committed to understanding, and he's sometimes compelled to put forward his view of divine intervention as the product of his rational analysis of the available evidence. Perhaps the most striking example of this approach is when Herodotus asserts his view at 2120, that the gods were responsible for the destruction of Troy, though of course Paris plays a crucial role here too. The gods are imagined to respond to his unjust deeds. So the overall effect of human and divine agency in Herodotus is highly nuanced. And here I draw attention to Rosario Munson's recent assessment on causes of events in Herodotus, taken from the Herodotus Encyclopedia. Sometimes causes sacred and secular overlap or intersect. At other times, the historian opts solely for causes that pertain to human beings or divinity, while at other times still, most memorably in the case of Croesus, perhaps, a plethora of human and divine causes are given with no apparent hierarchy or preference on the author's part. Such is the lot of the historian, according to Herodotus, who must sift amongst and interpret a dizzying array of sources of information, some credible, some no doubt less so. And there I finish, and I will just, for the benefit of those who access this talk on YouTube, add this slide here, which shows some of the bibliography that informed this talk. Thank you very much for listening.